Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this presentation titled ARM, Bicep, Knees, and Toes, Infrastructure as Code for Beginners. Probably helps if I turn it on. A little bit about me. My name is Sam Gomez. Fun fact is I'm originally from Mexico. I am currently a tech lead at a consulting company called Jenica. And when I'm not doing something technology related, I love to spend time with my wife and my two kids, watching movies, playing video games, and I'm super passionate about anything soccer related, watching, playing, or even coaching. I love that. Um, you can get in touch with me at the Soccer Dev on Twitter or now X. I would love to connect on LinkedIn as well in case that you have any questions about any of the tools that we're going to talk about today after the presentation. So the agenda for today, we're going to talk about who is this talk for. We're going to talk about the what is infrastructure as code. And then we're going to do a quick overview of the different tools, compare them against each other, and we're going to see that on a demo as well. So who is this talk for? I put this together, or the idea came because of the experience I had when I first worked with ARM templates. I'm not an infrastructure person, I'm a software developer. So for me, working with those templates, the very first time, it was something that I think I felt had a little bit of a learning curve. So I wanted to put together this presentation to go over the basics, but also show a few tips and tricks that might help you get started with the infrastructure as code journey that might make it easier for you. It'll save you some headaches. So if you work with, if you're completely new to infrastructure as code, or if you have experience with one of the tools that we're going to talk about, but not the others, this talk is definitely for you. So infrastructure as code. I don't know if you guys have run into this situation, but usually it's very common that in an organization or a company, there's one person that knows everything about the servers, how they're configured, what they're running. But it's usually that one person only, and their documentation is in one place only, right here. So that person never leaves, or that person is out sick, it's just a disaster because no one else knows what's going on with the infrastructure. So infrastructure as code tries to deal with not just this scenario, but tries to make this process automated. So we don't have one person clicking boxes, configuring stuff manually. Consistent, if we have templates, then we know that our resources are going to be deployed the exact same way every single time, and we want to do it in a repeatable manner. So we want to do it as many times as we need, so that we have our infrastructure ready to go, or we can spin up environments on the spot in case that we need to troubleshoot something, or we need to do demos without using an environment, or without having an environment running all the time. There are many tools out there that allow you to do infrastructure as code. The ones that we're going to talk about today are ARM templates, Bicep, and finally, Terraform. So we're going to start with ARM templates. So these are files that are in the JSON format and have a declarative syntax, and it defines the infrastructure but also the configuration. So you can say, I want to deploy a web application, I want to deploy a SQL server, and I want to deploy with this feature. So it's not just the infrastructure, it's also what kind of processing power, things like that. The basic structure of a file looks like this. So at the very top, we have the schema element, which tells us since this is calling an API behind the scenes, there's different version of the schema that is updated by Microsoft. The content version, that is for you to keep track of the version of the template. So apart from having that in source control somewhere, you can specify here if it's version 1, version 0, point 1, whatever, however you want to handle the versioning in your files, in your templates. The API profile, again, this behind the scenes is making a call to an API. So you can specify the version that the resources are going to use at a template level, or you can do it individually on the resources as well. That's really depending on what you want to do. Parameters, so you have the option to make these templates dynamic. So depending on the environment, for example, you can provide different values to those parameters. So maybe you probably want your dev environment to not have, the highest SKU or the most expensive SKU. And then when you get to obviously staging, for example, or production, you want to make sure that you have the right resources deployed. Variables, just like in any other programming language, if there is a value that you're going to use multiple times throughout the template, then you can define that in the variable section, and then you can reuse that friendlier name throughout your template. The function section, it allows you to define your own functions. It is a little bit limited, so you can't build any function like you do with a programming language. It's limited to just only certain things that you can do. And that is only if the built-in functions do not cover what you're trying to do. So out of the bat, there's some functions that exist already. I haven't run in a situation where I actually have to build my own functions, but that is something that you have at your disposal. Resources, obviously, here's where you specify what is it that you want to deploy. And then finally, the outputs. If there are any values that you need to produce as an output. So maybe this template is being deployed as part of a pipeline, and you want to provide the value of the web app resource, for example, so that you can deploy your code to that specific web app, or you need any of the values generated in here, you can specify those as outputs, like I said, so that you can use them in another step of your deployment pipeline. All right, so we're going to look at a file. We're going to look at a couple of different commands, and like I said, a few tips and tricks that might help you get started with deployments with ARM. And since we've all done demos in the past, we know that we can run into a lot of trouble. Demo gods are very fickle that way. So I have this little prayer that I found online in this blog. So let this code compile in not an hour, but a little while. Allow this application to run with speed and zest, as this will keep users glued to my test. If my code blows up in my face, do it with style and grace. And last but not least, when all is said and run, let thy requirements have been correctly done. All right, let's see if that worked. So I'm going to look at this app service. All right, so this is what a file looks, an ARM template looks when it's populated. Let's give it a second. Loading. All right. So at the top again, we have the schema section. Then we have the content version. Here I just have version 1. You can add metadata elements as well if you need to do that throughout your template. And then here is where we go to the parameters portion. So as you can see here, I have an SKU name parameter. I am saying that is a type string, and I'm providing a default value. So if you have parameters, you don't want your deployment to fail because you failed to provide one, or maybe you do. That's obviously up to however you want to configure your deployments. But you have the option of providing a value if you don't want that to produce a failure. You also have the option to specify the values that are allowed for that particular parameter. So for example, you might want to make sure that nobody ever deploys a resource in the most expensive tier of whatever resource you're deploying. So you can specify those kind of things here. So you maybe just want to reduce it to just F1. That's all I want anyone to be able to deploy. And then here, and again, another metadata. So there's a description of what this does, what that particular parameter does. And this goes back to what I was saying, that sometimes there's no documentation on what our infrastructure looks like. These templates can be self-documented by adding these kind of descriptions in here. So anyone can look at that and can see, okay, what's that parameter? That parameter, this is what we're using it for. You can do the same with resources, and that helps you with having some sort of documentation right there at the template level. I'm not going to go through all the parameters, but we're going to go to the variables. So this is what I was saying earlier, that you don't want to be writing all this every single time that you need access to that value throughout the template. So again, just like in any programming language, we're going to use instead the hosting plan name variable, and we're just going to access that value that way. So for example, this SQL Server name, you'll see here, this is how you access variables. So you use this variables function and you give it the name of the function, and that will give you access to the value that you defined up here. In a similar way, parameters, you use that function parameters, and then you pass the parameter that you want to pull, and this you will give you the value that you passed in the parameters file or that you defined somewhere up in your template. So this particular template deploys a SQL Server, an app service, database, and a application insights resource into Azure. And we're going to see in a little bit that the Bicep template that I have also deploys the same resources so that we can compare what they're both doing there. So we have some firewall rules for our SQL Server. And this one, I'm not producing any output out of this deployment. So we don't have anything in there. Now, as I said, one of the things that I wanted to talk about during this presentation are some tips and tricks that might make your life easier when you're dealing with these templates. One of them, if you're using Visual Studio Code, is the extension, the ARM template extension, which will give you access to this outline that you see over here. So this is part of that particular extension, and what it allows you to navigate through that template a little bit easier. So if you click on any part or any element of this outline, it will not only take you there, but it will highlight whatever resource or value you're trying to access. So it makes it a lot easier to work with these templates when you have that ability. Now, another thing that you can do, let's say that you already have resources deployed to Azure, but you want to start putting those into templates so that you're able to deploy them in an automated fashion. So you can do that by going into any of those resources that you have already deployed. And on this left-hand side, you go to the export template. That is going to generate an ARM template for that particular resource that you have there. So you can literally take this, put it, save it, whatever repo you want to start saving your templates, and you're good to go. You will obviously have to provide some of the sensitive parameters. So if you're deploying a SQL Server, you're going to have to provide your whatever admin username and password you use to set it up. So it's not going to generate that in this functionality. But again, it gives you a really good starting point so that you don't have to write these templates from scratch. Now, one thing to call out for this is that the way that these templates are generated, it generates every single thing that you can configure. So every single property that you can configure is going to be part of these templates. So you might have to do a little bit of cleanup if you don't want to have those sections there. But again, it's still a good way to get started, especially if you already have a ton of resources deployed. Now, another thing that this extension does is Let's say that you do want to start completely from scratch because, I don't know, because that's what you want to do. So if you have that Visual Studio extension, you can just start typing ARM, and then it produces the skeleton that we saw at the beginning. But you can do the same thing down here. So let's say I want to create a template that deploys a web app. So you type ARM web app, and then it automatically creates a section, a resource in that section that you could actually take this template and run it like that, provided that you don't have another web app with that similar name. You could actually deploy this, take this and deploy it to Azure. So again, another way, another shortcut that might help you make it easier to work with these templates, and will make it easier and faster. Will get you, will take you down your infrastructure as code journey a lot faster. All right. So let's look at one. We're going to talk about real quick. Pause real quick here. Any questions about ARM templates before I move on to the? Okay. Unfortunately, these first two that we're going to talk about, ARM templates and Bicep, are exclusive, are Azure exclusive. Yeah. So Bicep is an open source library or an open source language, but you can only deploy to Azure because behind the scenes it calls the Azure API, the Azure Resource Manager API. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, but yeah, that's the limitation of those two, which is why we're going to talk about Terraform as an option for those two. All right, I'm going to continue with the presentation, and then we'll circle back to some of those demos, because some of them take a little bit to get going. So all right. So as you can see, those ARM templates can get pretty big if you're deploying multiple resources. So this is something that a lot of people that were working with infrastructure as code went over to Microsoft and said, hey, let's try to build something better, something that will be easier to read, and that's how Bicep came along. So it is a domain-specific language that it basically wants to make your life easier when we're talking about infrastructure as code. It's a transparent abstraction over ARM templates. So behind the scenes, this is getting transformed, or when that gets compiled, it actually gets transformed into an ARM template. It just makes it easier for you to actually write those templates. And this is what it looks like. So you can see right away that it will look very familiar. It looks like some of the other programming languages that you might have dealt with before. So starting with the scope, so we can tell the deployment whether this is a resource group deployment, a subscription, or at the tenant level. And then this is how we define parameters. So we start with this keyword param, then the parameter name, what data type, and if we want to, we can provide a default value just like we did for ARM templates. Then this is how you declare a variable. So again, the same thing, since this is eventually going to be transformed into an ARM template, you have pretty much the same sections. Then resource, so we have the symbolic name. So this is how you're going to refer to that particular resource throughout your template. And then here's where you're going to specify the resource type and again, the API version that you want to use. So here's where you specify Microsoft.SQL Server, and then again, here you're going to specify the API version. And then here is where you're going to specify the properties that you want to set for those particular resources, so for that infrastructure. One big difference that Bicep has is that it has this concept of modules. So you can use other Bicep templates and reference them in your Bicep, throughout Bicep templates. So let's say that your applications are normally going to have a web application and then SQL Server and an application inside. You can create that as a module and then just reference it throughout other templates. So let's say one of your the new application that you're working on, apart from the usual resources, also needs an AI service, for example. You can just reference the generic application template, and then apart from that, declare that AI service that the other ones don't have. And then finally, just like with ARM templates, you are able to output or produce output from your deployments. So like I said, the modules allow you to reference not only Bicep, but also ARM template files. So let's say that you already have ARM templates, but you want to start migrating to Bicep. You can create Bicep files that reference your existing ARM templates and just start migrating those slowly, one by one. You don't have to do the migration all at once. And you can also import modules from private or public registries. So there's a lot of modules out there for Bicep. There's a lot of samples, and you can actually reference those modules if you go to those public registries, or if at your organization you want to be able to share those templates across different parts of the organization, you can create a private registry and just reference those templates from that private registry that you have. And we're going to see that in the demo in a little bit. You also can do things like conditional deployments. So if you only want to deploy resources if a particular condition is met, you have the ability to do that in this way. And then you can do loops. So you can define multiple copies of resources, modules, variables, properties, and outputs. And there's different versions of the loop that you can have. So loop over an index, loop over items, loop over dictionary items, loop over integer index and items, items with a conditional, and that's some of the things that you can do with Bicep. So let's take a look at that. All right. We'll go over here. We'll head out to Bicep. Service. So this is a template that is doing the exact same thing as the ARM template that we saw before. So it is deploying the exact same thing: a SQL Server, a web app, and an application insights resource. So, and you have these type of description decorators that allow you to document your template, sort of. And again, you can specify what values are allowed for that particular parameter. You can specify minimum and maximum values as well. So if you only want to be able to deploy a certain number of resources. And as you can see, everything else is pretty much the same that we saw in an ARM template as far as the sort of the structure goes. But I don't know about you, but to me, this looks a lot easier to read than that JSON file. Because this, as a programmer, as a developer, this looks familiar. This looks like something that I could encounter in other programming languages. So this is an example of a resource. So you have resource. It's called SQL Server throughout the template. And here's where you're specifying the type, and again, the version of that particular resource. So you're specifying the location, and then here we're specifying a login and password. And as you can see here, so SQL Server, where we can use that, but you can also use properties from these resources. So for example, let's so if you need the ID, if you need access to the identity of that particular resource, you're able to do that. You're able to access it as if it were an object in other programming languages. So again, deploying the exact same things. And there is also a Bicep extension for Visual Studio Code, which you also want to get if you're going to work with this, because it allows you to navigate through all the resources and all the different sections of your template. But it also allows you to do, actually, let me read this. So if you already have resources in Azure and you want to start deploying them automatically, if we go to properties, you copy this resource ID, you hit 1, third Bicep resource, so it generated the template automatically. You can just take this, save it. You can deploy this through an automated deployment the next time you need to do that. So that is one of the really cool things that it allows you to do. And again, you don't have to write your templates from scratch, which, developers, we love shortcuts. We love when somebody makes our lives easier. So great thing to have. And other things that you can do, again, very, very cool. You right click and you click on Open Bicep Visualizer. It provides you a visual of all the resources that you have and what are the dependencies or what are the relationships between them. So here is showing everything that we are deploying right there. So you can identify if there might be an issue with your template. So for example, I was putting together another template earlier for a different demo. So here I'm creating a bunch of resources, and I'm putting some of those, or I'm saving some of those to the key vault. But something that I didn't notice is that this one over here is not being stored in key vault, and I definitely wanted to do that. So having that visualizer is a great way to determine if there are any issues with your templates. So great tool to have if you ask me. All right, 1 second. All right. I am going to keep going, and then we'll come back to some of those demos in a little bit. All right, before I continue, any questions about ARM templates or Bicep as of right now? And we'll see some of those templates run in a minute. We'll circle back to that. All right, Terraform, the last tool that we're going to talk about. This slide has to be updated. It's no longer open source. It used to be open source. There is a project out there now that is called Open Tofu, I think it's called. So it's a fork of Terraform that aims to keep that project as open source. So it's an infrastructure as code tool for provisioning and managing infrastructure. It uses the HCL syntax. So that HCL stands for HashiCorp Corporation Language, and can provision resources to multiple cloud providers or multiple services. So if anything has an API that is and it has a provider, you can deploy resources to it. So Terraform has this concept of providers. So these are plugins that are used to interact with cloud providers, software as a service providers, and other APIs. So you could build your own Terraform plugin or Terraform provider if you wanted. If you want to give people access to create resources from your APIs, you can create your own provider if that's something that you want to do. So at the very core, there's two main elements of the syntax that are part of the language, which are the arguments, which is when you assign a value to something, and then the blocks. So this is how you configure a resource as an example. So that's what you're going to see in a lot of the Terraform templates. Terraform also has the concept of modules. So these are containers that are containers from multiple resources, and the Terraform registry has publicly available modules. So if somebody has already built something that a module that you might need, you might want to check the Terraform registry. There might be something that you can just download and reuse in your templates. Now, one difference between Terraform and the other two is that Terraform has what is called a state file. So this stores the status of your infrastructure, and it gets compared every time that you try to do a deployment. So that way, Terraform knows what changes you're trying to make to your infrastructure, and it can give you a result, or it can let you know, hey, I'm going to change this, I'm going to add this, I'm going to delete this, so that you can take a look at that and figure out if you actually want to make those changes, if you actually want to move forward with those deployments. All right. So over here, I have a few templates. So I have an app service template. So you can see here at the top, we are saying what the required providers are for this particular template. So we're saying that we need the Azure provider for Terraform. We can also specify which versions we need. And everything else, you can see, you compare to Bicep, the syntax is very similar. And again, it's a lot easier to read than something like ARM templates. So this is just generating a random integer for the resource group. And that is also defined. Where is my random? I can't see my random provider. But I have the service plan, I have a web app, and then it's trying to deploy from a GitHub repo. So if I do, well, when you do Terraform, you do a Terraform init. That's not the folder that I want to be in. So Terraform and app service. So that initializes your backend to make sure that you have everything that you're going to need in order to do those deployments. Get the name that I use for this file. All right, so that is going to take that template and it's going to figure out what are the resources that you're going to deploy. So it's going to take a little bit to to run, and when it's finished, it's going to tell you, it's going to give you that report. All right, I'm going to add this, I'm going to remove that, I'm going to change this other resource. and then you have the option to decide if you want to apply that or not. So here it's saying that it's going to add 4. It's not going to change anything, and it's not going to destroy anything. And if you scroll up, you can see everything that it's actually going to create. So anything with a plus sign are resources that are going to be created. So you have the guide of the syntax there. Anything that's going to be removed is going to have a minus. And then we'll see if last command that you need to know, Terraform apply, and now when that is running, because it's in use, look at it in a second, but this state file is what I was talking about earlier, that it allows you, or it gives you the information of what resources you have deployed, and that is what gets compared whenever you run your plan, and now when you're doing that deployment. So you'll see here, it's creating the resource group, and then it's going to start creating all those resources inside of that resource group. So if we go over here, we go into resource groups, let's filter. So this is the resource group that is being created right now, and in a little bit we will go in there and we can see all the resources that have been deployed. So let's click on that. It has created anything. So that web app is already created, and it's going to continue creating all the other resources that we have in there. So we will let it finish. And then what we're going to look at, actually, while we look at that, we'll go back to the Bicep section. So this is an example of a Bicep template that is using an ARM template as a module, or is importing that as part of the module. So if I were to run this, it would deploy a resource, even though I have not defined it in here. And that's because it's using this, again, as a module. It's saying, okay, look at this file. These are the parameters that I'm passing through, and then I'm going to deploy it. I'm going to reference it like that, and I'm going to deploy it. Another example of how you can use those modules, I'll pull this up in a little bit, but I have a registry and a container registry in Azure. I uploaded a template up there, and in this template, I can just reference that and deploy my SQL Server. This is still running. So there you go. It's created the app service in the app service plan. It's going to keep running in the meantime. So while that is still running, we're going to go over here. Again, the biggest advantage that Terraform has over the other two is that you can deploy resources, or not only Azure, but you can deploy resources to other cloud providers. So for example, particular template, it's deploying to Google Cloud. So you only have, if you're using Terraform, you only have to learn one language, and you can deploy to multiple providers. So if you have a mix of providers, for example, if you have resources in Azure and AWS for whatever reason, then that's the Terraform is what you want to go with, because you'll be able to just use one language and deploy to different providers. So again, specifying the provider that we want to use. We're specifying which credentials we want to use for the deployment. We're deploying a Google App Engine application, and then a couple of SQL Server, or couple of SQL instances in here. So again, you can deploy it just as easily as we're deploying this one, although And I don't know if it is the network or it's just my prayer didn't really work, but it's taking a while to create this resource. So we'll see how many more templates we can deploy. So actually, while that is going, so which one should you use? And as it so happens in technology, the answer to that question is, it depends. So some of the things that you want to consider when you're making this decision, obviously Terraform. If your resources are not in Azure, even if you want to deploy on-prem, Terraform is really going to be your only option out of these three. If you have a mix of cloud providers, like I said, if you have resources in Google Cloud, in Azure, in AWS, for whatever reason, that is the Terraform is the way to go. And finally, it's a little bit more accessible for developers. So if you don't have a dedicated infrastructure team that is going to be taking care of this, and your developers are the ones that are going to be doing that, I think this is a lot more accessible, a lot easier to read than ARM templates, especially. Bicep, only Azure resources, very obviously restricted. If you want to be able to share your templates and you want to take advantage of reusability, Bicep is the way that you want to go. Again, much more accessible to developers than ARM templates. Then finally, if it is important to you, with Terraform no longer being open source, Bicep is open source. If that is important to you, that might be another thing that you want to consider. And then finally, ARM templates, again, limited to Azure. If you have an infrastructure team and they are proficient in ARM templates, they're comfortable with them, and they don't want to learn a new language, then it's fine to stick with them, because at the end of the day, Bicep templates are going to get compiled into ARM templates. So, like I said, if your team has experience with ARM templates and they're more than happy to continue using those, and you don't really need some of the other advantages that Bicep has, then you're more than welcome to keep working with ARM templates. All right. Well, let's see if that finished. Still going. All right. There's one more thing that I can show in the meantime. That doesn't work. That is, so I can pull up any of these. So another thing that you can do, if you want to go to Bicep, is if you right-click on an ARM template, again, if you already have ARM templates, you can click on Decompiled into Bicep, and that will generate a Bicep template with that particular resource. So again, another way that you can make that jump or make that migration without having to write the templates from scratch is by using that particular tool. Now, other thing that we mentioned during the presentation that we wanted infrastructure as code for is to make things automated, right? We didn't want somebody to have to execute a command or PowerShell script or anything like that. So if you have used Azure DevOps, this is an example of how you can add your ARM templates as a step in your deployment. So if you create a release pipeline, you can put all your resources, all your templates in a repo, and then you can specify that get from that repo, and you can pass all the parameters that the template needs. So the resource group, what template you're going to use, any other parameters that you need to pass, and you can have this release pipeline run automatically if you want. You can do it as a CI/CD trigger. You can set all sorts of different things. Another thing that you probably want to do is keep your resource templates and your code separately. That way you can specify different access policies for the repo. So maybe you don't want your developers to have access to make check-in changes, or maybe you want to set up different pull request policies, maybe request that 2 or 3 people, or I don't know how many, need to be able to approve a pull request. So having those in separate resources or in separate repos allows you to do that. You can also do it through GitHub Actions. So if you work with GitHub Actions, you can create your pipelines the same way, and you can deploy those templates automatically as well. All right, let's go back. Still going. Yeah, I don't think it's ever taken that long to create these resources. So that is all I have for right now. Any questions about anything that we've touched on today? All right. If not, that's all I have. Thank you very much. Then one last thing, if you want access to the presentation, it has some links in there that will take you to the documentation for ARM templates, Bicep, and Terraform. And again, if you want to connect, you have questions later, or you just want to network, more than happy to connect with you guys. Thank you.